Hi, this is Michael from The Intersection. Thanks for joining us. Now, for each of our episodes here on The Intersection, we'll be following up the first segment with an interview with an expert on the topic. Our interview is with Professor Gary Foley, an activist, an academic, an actor. A Gumbayngirr man from the mid-north coast of New South Wales, Gary Foley has been at the forefront of Indigenous activism since his involvement in the Black Power movement in the late 60s. It would take a long time to go through all the things he has done, but in short, he was one of the founders of the Aboriginal Tent Embassy in Canberra in 1972, an early force behind the Aboriginal Legal Service, the Victorian Aboriginal Health Service, an actor in movies such as Backroads and Dogs in Space, and a tireless voice for Indigenous people in numerous forums. He's also an historian and in recent years is Professor of History at Victoria University. Our interview is mainly concerned with the time in the mid-1980s when Gary was director of the Aboriginal Arts Board and his frontline activism in the Bicentennial protests of 1988. Gary, you joined the Aboriginal Arts Board in 1983 following the election of the Hawke government. Can you tell us a bit of how the Arts Board was up till that time?
Well, when you say I joined the Aboriginal Arts Board, I was press ganged into joining the Aboriginal Arts Board by one of my early mentors, Chicka Dixon. Chicka, I'd rashly promised Chicka a decade before when Chicka was just a project officer with the Aboriginal Arts Board. And from the time Whitlam had created the Aboriginal Arts Board in 1973, right up until 1983, the Aboriginal Arts Board administration had been run by non-Aboriginal people. And I said to Chicka 10 years earlier when Chicka used to complain to me about that situation, I said to him, used to say to him, "Don't worry, Fox." That was his nickname, and they didn't call him the Fox for nothing. I said, "Don't worry, Fox. One day you'll be the boss, and I'll come in and watch your back." 10 years later, in 1983, Chicka rings me up and says, "Hawke's just appointed me chairman of the Aboriginal Arts Board. Remember the promise you made?" And so, I felt compelled, but it was an exciting time, ever since Whitlam had sold us out on his promise to deliver land rights. The Aboriginal political movement was on a roll. We'd set up an Aboriginal Information Centre in London. We were spreading propaganda through a network of support groups throughout Europe. We were kicking a few goals. And we'd taken the fight right up to the Fraser government. So then along comes Hawke. He appoints Chicka as chairman of the Aboriginal Arts Board, and I went in. And because the Aboriginal Arts Board for the previous 10 years had been run by non-Aboriginal people, when I checked the books, I discovered that around 80% of Aboriginal Arts Board money for the previous 10 years had been going to non-Aboriginal people. And so Chicka and I introduced a new policy immediately that no non-Aboriginal people would be funded while we were running the board. And that was a rule we strictly adhered to, much to the shock and horror of some, but it proved a very effective means of, well, for a start, more than doubling the amount of money available to Aboriginal artists and performers. And so Chicka and I had very strong political opinions about who should be funded and who shouldn't. I suppose like any crew people of an opposing position to us, well, they had been for the previous 10 years, and they determined where the money went. It was our turn
So that's amazing that so much of the funding had previously been going to non-Aboriginal activities. Can you recall what some of those were? Like where some of that funding went to?
To all manner of scam artists. Well,
Mm,
I'm probably being a bit nasty, but I mean, they were going to non-Aboriginal companies that maybe employed a few token Aboriginal people to
okay.
sit near the door and make things look good. But as with all federal government money since Whitlam, the majority of all of that money goes to non-Aboriginal people to this day. And I'm not talking about the Arts Board now, I'm talking about Aboriginal affairs generally.
Mm-hmm.
And, one day Australians ought to wake up and ask questions about that. But,
Okay.
all that means is that Aboriginal people, the vast black underclass remains in pretty much the same situation they were up to 50 years ago. Nothing changes.
Wow, it's a lot to take on board. Um, but back to at the time yourself and Chika took over
Yep.
the agency, I know at the time you redirected where some of the funding was going to, made it a bit more broad based across the arts.
Well, we
Um,
began to fund people like Tracy Moffat. I mean, Tracy Moffat, one of the biggest artists in the world
yeah,
nowadays, fated in New York. Richard Bell, you know, just had a massively successful stay in Germany at the Republica Arts event over there. He opens at the Tate next month. A lot of the people who we supported back then, some of them have gone on to international recognition,
yeah.
and Kicker and I were the first to not only know and recognize that they were out there in our community, but were able to channel resources for them to help kick them off.
Well, no fixed address. So we've played a little earlier in the program. I know received a Arts Board grant to help them get overseas. Did you get any resistance from funding a young rock band?
Um, Not in terms of No Fix. I mean, No Fix were kicking goals
Mm,
themselves at the
yeah,
time we came in to support them. And I'd known the boys from Adelaide from many years before. So I was familiar with them, familiar with bands like Coloured Stone, one of the contemporaries of No Fix.
yep,
And, music, both Chicker and I recognised that, the arts was more than just, somebody painting a picture, that the arts and especially artistic endeavours that were helping to get a particular message across to the broader Australian community about the situation that Aboriginal people were in, and No Fix fit that bill perfectly, and it was the right time for them, I thought.
yeah, absolutely. I find it interesting because you must have been one of the only government-supported agencies in the 80s that actually were helping fund rock music, basically, or contemporary music, because it wasn't happening in a lot of other areas at
Well,
that
I
time.
mean, the Australia Council was a strange place for a bloke like me at that point in my life. I mean, now that I look back on it 40 whatever years later, I think to myself, gee, I don't know how they let us get away with a lot of the stuff we did. Chicker and I, Chicker was a charmer. So he could go into the Australia Council meetings and charm all these highfalutin, high art sort of types that were the rest of the Australia Council at that time. And the only two boards in the Australia Council at that point that weren't funding things like the opera and that was the Community Arts Board and the Aboriginal Arts Board.
Yeah.
And my old mate John O'Hawks was the director of the Aboriginal Arts Board, the Community Arts Board. And so he and I, on the administration side, were considered the enfant terribles of the Australia Council. But, whilst we were delivering, nobody could interfere with us. Chicka had a lot of control over, what we did, so that we were fit. We were by far the most independent of all of the, highfalutin boards of the Australia Council.
And most forward-thinking in a lot of ways as well.
I think that's because, both John O'Hawks and I were younger than a lot of the, some of the others in the Australia Council. And John O'Hawks had come out of the, he was one of the founders of Circus Oz years before. So we were probably considerably more left-leaning than other people in the Australia Council. But then, having said that, we did. Donald Horne was the chair of the Australia Council at one point when I first went there, I think, and he was replaced by Timothy Pascoe, who, despite his bow ties and his fancy way of talking, was very supportive of what we were doing, luckily. Which is probably another reason why we were able to do some of the things we did.
Gary, you've written extensively about the Hawke government's failure to legislate for land rights as they had promised to do in the 1983 election. For any of our listeners who are maybe not fully aware of that story, can you just tell us a bit about that?
Well, a decade earlier in 1973, Gough Whitlam had become Prime Minister, loudly announcing in his policy speech that his government would deliver Aboriginal land rights. It only took 6 months for Whitlam to renege on that policy when he realised what he was up against. And so land rights was off the table politically for another 10 years. Then in the lead up to the 83 election in which Hawke got in, Hawke loudly proclaimed to all and sundry that his government would deliver national uniform land rights legislation, regardless of what opposition from the states. They would legislate to bring that about immediately. Well, again, it only took about 9 months, and Bob Hawke got pressured by the then corrupt president of the ALP, Mr. Brian Burke, and I'm not accusing him, loosely. He went to jail for corruption more than once. And at the time, though, of the Hawke government, he was the national president of the ALP and one of the power brokers in the ALP because of the vast amount of money he was bringing into the party, especially from contributions from the corrupt property developers in Western Australia and the mining industry. And Brian Burke was in the pocket of the mining industry. And Brian Burke said to Bob Hawke, there's no way you can go ahead with this land rights for Aborigines nonsense. And so Hawke reneged, which then, by the time Hawke reneged on his promise, my 3-year term at the Aboriginal Arts Board was coming up. The other thing that Chicka and I did when we went in, we told people we were only staying for one term because we both believed that if we stayed any longer within the bureaucracy, it would invariably and inevitably corrupt us. And so to ensure that everybody kept us to our word, we let people know before we went in that's what we were going to do, and that's what we did. And so by the time I left the Aboriginal Arts Board, I became involved in the creation of the body that took the fight politically to the Hawke government, and that was the National Aboriginal Islander Health Organisation. And so for the next few years or so, we saw as a great opportunity coming up the Bicentennial, because that was a perfect target for us to politically agitate around, and with luck to fuck up the great party that Bob Hawke was hoping to have with him as the central focal point, So, so Aboriginal people began organising in advance of the Bicentennial, and the Bicentennial Committee came up with the perfect thing for us. They declared that 1988 would be the great celebration of the nation, which enabled some of our wits to come up with the counter proposition that it was the great masturbation of the nation.
As it was.
Which worked perfectly,
It certainly did, and that term certainly caught on at the time. So on January 26, 1988, I was at the rally in Hyde Park along with 40,000 other people, and you were the MC that day, of course. And that day changed me as a 20-year-old white kid at the time. I felt for the first time I got a glimpse of an Australia that would be a much better place and could be a much better place than the one that I'd been brought up in. I'm just curious, what are your memories of that day, particularly, and of the week before when so many Aboriginal people came to Sydney?
Well, I mean, it was historic in the sense that, well, many senses, but one of the senses that was historic, that made it historic, was the largest gathering of Aboriginal people in Australia, in Australian history. In the 80,000 year history of Australia, that was by far the biggest single gathering of Aboriginal people. And it was a powerful feeling, not just for 40,000 people like you who were there, but for us as well, it was it was just lucky on the day that we didn't realise that the next 40 years would be caught up in history wars and culture wars and Pauline Hanson and the whole sort of counter effect then of the positivity of that single day in 88.
Yeah, which it certainly was, yeah. I did some study on the Bicentennial not that long ago, and looking at the international press from that time, if they covered it at all, what they wanted to know about was Indigenous Australia. They had very little interest in the celebratory aspect of it.
Absolutely, which was, completely the opposite of what Bob Hawke had been hoping for. He thought he was going to be there sitting at the centre along with Carlton Dyer, the central focal point of the day. And the New York Times reported on page 2, and virtually all of their report at the time when, back then when newspapers were important, the New York Times was the most important paper in the world. It gave a huge account on page 2, and virtually all of it was about what we did rather than what the rest of Australia did. And that was what we were trying to do on the day, we get our message across. We were hoping to get a message across to all Australians, but we hadn't sort of realised that it would have the impact it did in various other parts of the world, which once again demonstrated, as the Aboriginal Embassy had 10 years earlier, that Aboriginal political strategists have been very effective in getting their message across. The only trouble is we've been getting our message across for most of my life and for a long time before, but there still remains considerable resistance to our basic long-term aims,
In some ways, answered this question already, but in terms of, with so many years since then, would you still look on the protest of that period of being successful in terms of getting the reality of Indigenous Australia out to the world and also domestically to get it to a lot more people, such as myself at the time? Would you still see that as a successful protest?
Absolutely. I mean, each of our successful, some more than others, endeavours over the years have played an important role in making each new generation. Every time, it's almost generational each time. We reach a new generation each time. And we reach a significant part of each Australian generation each time, one of the most successful things of all time was the 1967 referendum. If one is to judge success by the fact that it's the biggest yes vote in Australian history, in excess of 90% of the Australian people, a clear and strong expression on the part of the vast majority of Australians in a referendum. And what did it change? Nothing. Because politicians chose to sit on their hands and ignore it for the first 6 years after the referendum. So not only did the most effective thing we've ever done, the 67 referendum, which illustrated at that moment in Australian history, there was a vast reservoir of goodwill towards Aboriginal people on the part of the Australian people. And yet even that was not sufficient to move corrupt politicians off their asses to actually do something about the expressed wishes of their own constituency, the Australian people.
Well, Gary, you've obviously moved into academia. You're a professor at Victoria University.
Indeed, I have. I'm the oldest still teaching professor at Victoria Uni, and I teach history to, and one of the reasons I'm still doing it, I enjoy teaching because unlike at Melbourne University Melbourne, where I used to teach and my old alma mater, when I was teaching at Melbourne Uni, I was teaching the children of the rich and the oligarchs of Asia and wherever. Whereas at Victoria University, I've got a different student demographic. A lot of asylum seekers, a lot of refugees, working class white Australians, and a small smattering of Aboriginal people. And I find that sort of student demographic much more interesting and challenging and fruitful to be working with.
So just for our Sydney listeners, Victoria University's in Footscray, is it? Is that your main campus?
Indeed it is.
So the inner west of Melbourne.
And to all those Sydney people, I'd point out that I don't think it's a great secret that I'm not a big fan of Sydney. I lived there many, many years ago, and I escaped to the last isolated outpost of civilization on mainland Australia, a place called Melbourne. You should come and visit.
So let's have a bit of Melbourne versus Sydney.
I've been here for 50 years, mate. I've sort of been accepted in. The Wurundjeri traditional owners down here have put up with me for 50 years, making trouble on their land, and they've been very patient and very hospitable to me. Well, thank you. Thank you, Wurundjeri people.
Well, I didn't expect a Sydney versus Melbourne debate to come on today, but you make a good point.
You gave me the opportunity.
I know.
I'm sorry, folks. I'm sorry about that.
That's all right. But I'm sure I recall you at a few gigs in Sydney in the mid-'80s. So you've always been a music fan. You appeared on stage with The Clash. So
indeed, I did. At the Capitol Theatre there in Sydney, I think it was. And that was an amazing crowd too of Sydney people. But the crowd that turned up at the Clash concert weren't necessarily the people I had problems with in Sydney years before.
Sure.
Because the people who I had problems with years before in Sydney wore uniforms, and they were particularly nasty and recent.
Yep. Well, Professor Gary Foley, this has been fantastic talking to you today. Thank you so much for your time and for, just giving us your wealth of information.
Thank you, folks, and my warm regards to all you Sydney folk up there.
Great. Thanks, Gary.
Thank you.
And thank you for listening to The Intersection. My name is Michael Fisher, production by Rob Margenberg. We'd like to give special thanks to Eastside Radio, 89.7 FM. And don't forget to follow The Intersection on social media. You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter or Instagram. Just search The Intersection _Eastside FM. The Intersection was recorded on Gadigal land. Sovereignty never ceded.